Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from the Evangelical Alliance Ireland. My name is Steve Vaughan. I'm the pastor of Christ City Church in Dublin. A feeling we all want to avoid is the feeling of being pitied. To be pitied removes some of our dignity when people look at us and they think, oh, they're trying their best, but she's a bit silly or he's a bit clueless. God love them. Oh, they're trying their best, but they've got it a bit wrong. And it's a bit embarrassing if we're honest, and maybe even a bit humiliating. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then Christians are to be pitied above all people in the world, because we are gullible fools who are believing a lie. 1 Corinthians 15:19, he says, if for only this life we have hope in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Some people today think Christians are stupid, that we believe strange things about morality and sexuality and other beliefs that we get from the Bible. And Paul says, you can ditch them all if Christ hasn't been raised. Because that's the foundation on which all our other beliefs are based. Paul says if Christ has not been raised, then we have no hope beyond this life. So we're just pretending something's to be true to comfort our hearts or to give us some hope or some meaning, but it's not true. We're working so hard to love God with all our heart, mind, soul and strength and love our neighbour as ourselves, but it's all a farce. So you should be pitied really, because you're rather stupid and you're rather silly and you're rather gullible. You're rather naive. But Paul says, that would all be true if Christ has not been raised from the dead. But in 1 Corinthians 15, he's at pains to say, but Christ has been raised from the dead. And so we too must remind ourselves day by day by day, especially when you feel intimidated or in the minority as a Christian. Especially when you do know that people think what you believe is silly or backwards. Especially when, and most of all, when people mock you for your faith. There's one sure way to give confidence to your heart in those moments, and confidence to you as a Christian. And that's to do what Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15 and go, yes, actually, I should be pitied if Christ hasn't been raised. I am a fool, but if Christ has been raised, I'm not a fool, and I can hold my head up high and have confidence. So how do we know Christ has been raised from the dead? Let me give you 3 reasons for confidence that just come out of 1 Corinthians 15 alone. There's more that could be said, but this is just from 1 Corinthians 15. Firstly, what Paul says here about Christ being raised from the dead is too early to be a legend or a myth. We know that Paul's letter to the Corinthians was written around AD 56, and he indicates in verses 1 to 4 of chapter 15 that he's already passed on this creed, these sayings about Jesus being raised from the dead to that church, which means it must have predated his visit in AD 51. Therefore, the creed was in use within 20 years of Jesus' resurrection. But many scholars trace it back even further still to 2 to 8 years after the resurrection, AD 32, AD 38, when either Paul received it on the Damascus Road or in Jerusalem. So this is incredibly early material rather than some later myth that developed about Jesus' resurrection decades and centuries later. It's too early for it to be a myth and a legend. Secondly, it's not only too early, there's too many for the witnesses just to have made it up as a conspiracy or to be all duped or all believing an illusion. In verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about 500 people at one time seeing the resurrection of Jesus. And in the Gospels, we read of multiple other accounts of Jesus meeting with individuals or groups of people to reveal himself as raised from the dead. There are too many people for this just to be some big conspiracy or just some make-believe or an illusion. Too many people are saying it and witnessing to this. It's too many. And thirdly, not only too early and too many, but these witnesses are still alive. And that's Paul's point in 1 Corinthians 15, whether the 12 apostles or many of the 500 or many others like the women that we read about who were the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection in the Gospels. In other words, Paul is saying, if you don't believe me, that's okay. Go and ask one of the other eyewitnesses. There's lots of them out there. Some have fallen asleep, some have died, but most are still living because it was so soon after Christ's resurrection. And then not only that, the big proof is that these witnesses then would go on to die for what they believed, and no one dies for a lie. What we believe is logical, it's rational, it's verifiable, it's historical, it's credible, and it's true. Since Christ has been raised from the dead as a fact of history, we can hold our heads up high as Christians. And even when the world mocks us, Christ's resurrection gives us immense dignity. God bless you, and join us again tomorrow for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from the Evangelical Alliance Ireland.